Let me tell you about a bend in the Muskegon River, up in the north woods of Michigan, just below the old town of Newaygo, in the autumn of 1978. If you have never stood on that riverbank, picture a wide brown stretch of water moving slow between two ridges gone gold with turning maples, and an old boat ramp that nobody used anymore because the mill it once served had been closed for longer than most people could remember. It was a quiet place. The kind of place where a man could do something strange for 2 years and give the whole county something to talk about. The man was Emmett Doyle. He had grown up in that valley, left it at 18, and come back at 43 with a diver's chest and a limp he never explained. For 20-odd years, he had worked as a salvage diver, going down under harbor pilings and bridge footings in cold black water where you cannot see your own gloves, feeling his way along drowned steel and drowned stone. He knew things about the underneath of water that no farmer in Newaygo would ever have reason to learn. And now here's what you need to understand. When Emmett Doyle came home, he did not buy a farm, or a store, or a boat for fishing. He bought river rights. He bought dive permissions along a 3-mile run of the Muskegon that not one person in the valley had ever wanted, because there was nothing down there but mud and drowned logs. Drowned logs. That is where the whole story begins. Back when the mill still ran, back before anyone living could remember it clearly, the loggers up on the ridges used to float their timber down the Muskegon in great spring drives. Thousands of logs riding the high water down to the mill pond. And every drive, a share of those logs got waterlogged and heavy and quietly sank to the bottom and stayed there. The men called them sinkers, deadheads. The company wrote them off as lost the day they went under, and the river closed over them. And 100 years went by, and everybody in the valley agreed there was nothing down there worth the trouble of getting wet. Everybody except Emmett Doyle. When word got around that Doyle was paying good money for the right to dive a stretch of dead river, the town did what small towns do. They talked. At the feed store, they said he had gone soft in the head down there in the dark water. At church, they lowered their voices and said it was a shame. A grown man chasing sunk garbage a century old. A boy named Tull who pumped gas out on the county road started calling him River-Crazy Doyle. And the name stuck the way an unkind name always does. Emmett heard it. He heard all of it. He would come into the diner, order eggs, and eat them while the room went half quiet around him. And he never once tried to explain himself. A woman in town asked him straight out one morning what a sane man wanted with a load of rotten drowned wood. He set down his fork and said, "It isn't rotten." And that was the whole of it. He picked the fork back up and finished his eggs. Now, here is the part that matters. Emmett Doyle carried a notebook. It was a battered thing. Black cover soft as cloth from being in and out of his coat 1,000 times. And he wrote in it constantly. If you had gotten a look inside, and almost nobody did, you would have found no ordinary journal. You would have found currents mapped by the season. You would have found the depth of the channel measured yard by yard. You would have found little inked crosses where the old log booms had broken loose in the flood years. Copied out of brittle mill records he had spent whole winters reading in the county library. Because a broken boom in a flood year meant a jam. And a jam meant logs on the bottom, stacked and waiting. He had done the arithmetic that nobody else had bothered to do. He believed with the flat certainty of a man who had already staked his savings on it, that under that slow brown water lay a fortune. He simply would not tell a living soul why. It is worth sitting with that a while, all the years since. A man will forgive you almost anything except doing a thing he cannot explain to himself. The valley could have understood greed, or foolishness, or grief. What it could not stand was a quiet man with a notebook, working alone at the edge of a dead river, acting for all the world as though he knew something the rest of them did not. And the truth, though none of them would have believed it that autumn, was that he did. By the first hard frost, Emmett had his gear laid out on the old ramp. An air compressor bought secondhand, a hose, a pair of lifting bags, a small flat-bottom boat he had patched himself. He would stand on that ramp at first light, breath steaming, checking his lines while a couple of pickup trucks slowed on the road above to watch and then drove on shaking their heads. He was not troubled by them. He had spent his whole working life alone in the dark, and being laughed at in the daylight was easier than that had ever been. But that is not what this story is really about. Because the first time Emmett Doyle went down after those logs, He learned that knowing where a thing lies and getting it up into the sunlight are two entirely different matters, and that the river had been keeping its logs for 100 years and did not intend to give them up to anybody in a hurry. And that is when everything began. The old log drives were the highways of their day. From roughly the 1800s through the early 1900s, timber cut in the hills was floated down high spring rivers to mills far below, because there were no roads that could haul it. On every drive, a portion of the logs became waterlogged and sank. Rivermen called them sinkers or deadheads and counted them as lost. The wood that went down, though, was old-growth timber, cut from forests hundreds of years old that no longer stand today, which is exactly why, a century later, those drowned logs would turn out to be worth far more than the men who lost them ever dreamed. Now, there was one man in the whole valley who did not laugh, and his name was Silas Renfrew. Silas was past 80 that winter, a widower who lived in a leaning house up the north road with a wood stove and a wall of faded photographs. What made him worth finding was his blood. His grandfather had been a river driver on the Muskegon, one of the last men to ride the spring logs down before the mill closed, and the stories had come down through the family the way a pocket watch comes down, handled and kept. Silas was the last man alive who remembered even secondhand where the old booms had stood and where the great jams had piled up and let go. Emmett had heard this, and one cold Saturday, he drove up the north road and knocked on the leaning door with his black notebook under his arm. Silas did not make it easy. That was not his way. He looked Emmett up and down on the porch and said, "You're the crazy one, the diver." Emmett said he supposed he was. The old man let him stand in the cold a good while before he said, "Well, wipe your feet." What followed, over that whole winter, was less a friendship than a long examination. Silas Renfrew tested him. Emmett would ask where the biggest jam of the flood years had lodged, and instead of answering, Silas would ask him what the river bottom felt like at the second bend, and whether the mud there was silt or gravel. And only when Emmett answered right, from memory, from having been down there in the dark and felt it, would the old man grunt and give up one more piece of what he knew. "My grandfather said the wood remembers," Silas told him one evening by the stove. "Cut 100 years dead and it'll still ring like a bell if the water kept it right. But the water don't keep it right everywhere. You have to know your river." And this is the part that matters, because it was not treasure hunting. It was a craft, and a slow one. Emmett learned to read the bottom of the Muskegon the way Silas read the surface. He learned that a sound sinker log lay heavy and true in the mud while a rotted one had gone soft and would crumble in your grip. He learned to work a chain around a drowned log by feel alone, in water so dark it made no difference whether his eyes were open or shut. He learned to clip on a lifting bag and feed it air a little at a time, so the log would rise slow and steady instead of tearing loose and shooting for the surface like a battering ram. "Patience," Silas kept saying. "The river gives nothing to a man in a hurry. It's had 100 years. It can wait on you." Emmett did not want to hear that. He was 43 years old and had spent his savings, and every week the town laughed a little louder. So the first true log he tried to raise, he rushed. He found a beauty at the third bend, a great white pine sunk deep in the mud, exactly where his notebook said a jam had let go in the flood of a distant spring. He got a chain on it. He got a bag on it. But the rope he used to steady it topside was an old, rotten line he had told himself would hold one more job. And when the log finally broke free of the mud and rolled, the rope parted with a crack like a rifle, and 100 years of drowned timber slid back down into the brown water, and was gone. Emmett came up empty, shaking, and drove straight to the leaning house. Silas did not comfort him. He looked at the frayed end of rope Emmett had brought to show him, and he said, "You knew that line was bad." Emmett said nothing. "You knew, and you used it anyway, because you wanted it now instead of right." The river felt that. It always does. Then softer, the old man added, "Buy good rope, then go back and do it slow." Emmett bought good rope. He rebuilt every part of his rig around the idea that the thing could wait, that he could wait, and it was the hardest lesson a hurried and desperate man ever swallowed. Let me tell you what happened the day the first log came up. It was late winter, ice still along the shallows. Emmett went down at the third bend for the second time, and this time he did everything the way Silas had drilled into him. He cleared the mud from the log by hand, patient, feeling the length of it. He set the chain true. He fed the bag air one slow breath at a time. And then he surfaced and stood in his little patched boat and waited, and the brown water bulged, and up came the end of a log black with 100 years of river, streaming mud, turning slow. He worked it to the ramp and rolled it half out of the water and took his axe and struck a corner clean to see the wood inside. Under the black skin, the pine was the deep red gold of old honey, tight-grained, dense as iron, sound all the way through. He knelt beside it a long time. Then he cut a thin slab off the end, wrapped it in a wet cloth, and set it in his truck like it was made of glass. A few of the neighbors saw that log lying on the ramp, and the town still laughed mostly. But not all of them. Old Harl, who ran the ferry crossing, came and stood a respectful way off and looked at the wood and said quietly that he'd never seen a grain like it on anything cut in his lifetime. A schoolteacher stopped her car and got out, and a dock kid named Nella Marsh, maybe 14, started coming down to the ramp after school just to watch, saying nothing, only watching. The way you watch a thing you cannot yet explain but somehow already know is real. Wood behaves strangely underwater. When a log sinks and settles into cold, low-oxygen river mud, the bacteria and fungi that normally rot fallen timber can barely survive, so decay slows almost to nothing. The log is preserved, sometimes for centuries. In some rivers, the water even carries minerals into the wood, darkening it and hardening it further. Combined with the tight, slow-grown rings of the old-growth trees these logs came from, that preservation is why a sinker pulled from the mud can be sounder, denser, and more beautiful than almost anything a modern sawmill can cut today. The summer that followed was the driest anyone in Newaygo could remember. The Muskegon fell and fell until the shallows showed gravel bars that had not seen the sun in years, and the ferryman grumbled and the farmers watched the sky. But for Emmett Doyle, the low water was a gift. It shortened his dives and cleared some of the murk, and all through that dry summer he brought up logs. White pine, white oak black as coal, and then from the deep hole below the second bend, something that made even Silas Renfrew sit up. Curly maple, log after log of it, the grain inside rippling like water frozen mid-motion when Emmett cut the ends clean. Now here is where the town began to turn, and it did not turn because of anything Emmett said, because he still said almost nothing. It turned because of what people could see. There was a gravel outfit that had dredged that same stretch of river years back and hauled up nothing but sand and old bottles and given up. And here was River-Crazy Doyle, working the very same water. And every week another great log lay drying on the ramp, wood the like of which nobody in the valley had ever laid eyes on. You can laugh at a man's idea. It is much harder to laugh at a row of logs worth more than your truck. Then came the day the outside man drove in. His name was Win Farrar, and he had come a long way, up from Detroit, because a slab of curly maple wrapped in a wet cloth had reached him through a friend of a friend, and he had not slept well since. Farrar built instruments, fiddles, guitars, the fine and fussy kind. He walked the row of logs on the ramp slowly, running his hand along the wood, and when he got to the maple he stopped and stood very still. "Do you know what this is?" he finally said. It was not really a question. He told Emmett that tone wood like this, old growth, slow grown, cured a century under cold water, simply could not be bought anymore at any price, because the forests that grew it were gone. He said the ripple in that grain would make an instrument sing in a way new lumber never could. And then he named a figure for a single log that made the ferryman, who had wandered down to listen, take off his hat and hold it against his chest. After that, the road above the ramp was never quite empty. Buyers came. A furniture man drove 300 miles to look. A pair of boatwrights came for the white oak. Cash moved, real cash. And Emmett Doyle, who had eaten his eggs in a half-silent diner for 2 years, was now a man the whole county wanted to shake hands with. Nella Marsh helped him keep the logs sorted and labeled. Silas Renfrew rode down in Emmett's truck some mornings just to sit on the ramp in the sun and watch the wood come up out of the river his grandfather had driven. The doubters had gone quiet. Some of them quietly had started to say they'd known all along there was something to it. But that's not what this story is really about, because 2 things happened that summer that a row of valuable logs could not fix. The first happened on a gray August morning at the deep hole below the second bend. Emmett had a big maple 3/4 free of the mud, air feeding into the bag, everything by the book, everything slow. But the river bottom there was not what his notebook said, and the log, as it lifted, rolled the wrong way and came down across his leg and pinned him to the mud in 14 feet of dark water. He told it only once, years afterward. He said the strange thing was how quiet it was. He said he had time to think that this was how the river collected what it was owed. His air hose was still good. That is what saved him. And he kept his head the way 20 years of blackwater diving had taught him. And he worked his hands under the log and fed the bag more air, a little at a time, patient even then, until the log lifted just enough for him to drag his crushed leg free and rise. He came up gray-faced and did not dive again for 3 weeks. When Silas heard, the old man only said, "The river will take a hurried man, but it'll test a patient one too, just to see what he's made of." The second thing was Hollis Crane. Now, Crane owned the gravel and timber operation 2 towns over, the same outfit whose dredge had once come up empty on that stretch of river. He was a prosperous man, and prosperous men do not enjoy watching someone they called a fool grow rich on water they gave up on. Crane could not beat Emmett Doyle in the river. He had already tried the river and lost, so he reached for the one weapon a prosperous man always keeps within reach. He hired a lawyer, and the lawyer found an old statute. And one afternoon a letter came to the leaning house and to the ramp and to the county office all at once. It said the logs on the bed of the Muskegon were not Emmett Doyle's at all. It said sunken timber on a navigable riverbed was the property of the state, that Doyle had been raising and selling public property without a salvage permit, and that until the matter was settled, every log was to stay right where it lay, and every dive was to stop. And here's the part that matters. Emmett Doyle had spent his whole life beating problems by going down alone into places no one else would go. He had never in his life won anything by asking for help, because he had never once asked. And now there was a threat lying on his kitchen table that no amount of patience underwater could touch. A threat made of paper and signatures and a rich man's grudge. And for the first time in the whole story, the crazy diver stood on the ramp looking at his river and had not the first idea what to do. Recovering sunken logs is only half the work. The wood must be cured before it can be used. A log pulled from the river is soaked completely through, and if it dries too fast, it will split and check and be ruined. Salvagers dry these timbers slowly, sometimes for a year or more, often milling them into rough slabs first and stacking them with spacers so air moves through evenly. Done right, the reward is remarkable. Dense, stable, deeply figured wood that instrument makers, fine furniture builders, and boatwrights will pay more for than almost anything a living forest can offer. Now here's what you need to understand about Emmett Doyle before the story reaches its end. The paper on his kitchen table did not frighten him because it might cost him money. It frightened him because it could not be solved the way he had solved every hard thing in his life, which was alone, underwater, in the dark, answering to no one. For 3 days he sat in the leaning house with Silas Renfrew, and the old man watched him turn it over and over. And finally Silas said the truest thing anyone said in the whole story. "You've been down there alone so long you forgot there's a whole town up here. A rich man's counting on you staying alone. So don't." That was the hardest dive Emmett Doyle ever made, and he made it on dry land. The next week the county held its hearing in the old Grange Hall. And Hollis Crane's lawyer stood up in a good suit and laid out the statute, cold and clean. And it was a strong case. Then Emmett Doyle stood up. This man who had eaten his eggs in silence for 2 years, who had never asked a soul for a thing, stood up in front of the whole valley that had called him crazy. And he asked them plainly for help. He said he had spent his savings and nearly his life bringing up wood the county had written off 100 years ago. He said he did not know the law, and he did not know how to fight a man like Crane. He said he only knew the river, and he was asking, for the first time in his life, whether anybody in that room would stand with him. And this is the part that matters. They did. They stood up one at a time. Old Harl the ferryman stood and said he'd watched that river his whole life, and never seen anybody take a single thing from it that the river missed. The school teacher stood and said Doyle had brought more history up out of that mud than the county museum held. A farmer whose grandfather had lost logs on those very drives stood and said as far as his family was concerned, any log the company abandoned a century back was fair salvage and good riddance. And then Silas Renfrew got slowly to his feet with a cardboard box, and he set out his grandfather's river ledgers on the table, the drive records, the account of every boom that broke and every load written off as lost. And he said the state had never once claimed those logs in 100 years, never counted them, never wanted them, until one prosperous man got sore about being beaten at his own game. You could feel the room turn. The county officials looked at the old ledgers, and they looked at Hollis Crane, and they saw plainly what this was. Within the month, the complaint was withdrawn. Doyle was granted a proper salvage arrangement, fair and legal, with a share set aside for the county historical fund, which was Emmett's own idea. And Hollis Crane, who had counted on a lonely man staying lonely, found himself the only man in the valley on his side of it. And he stopped coming around. But the logs, it turned out, were never really the point. And this is where the whole story finally opens up. That winter, Emmett Doyle bought the old dead mill by the ramp, the one that had closed before he was born. He did not tear it down. He put a roof back on it, and a stove in it, and long racks inside. And he began drying and milling his salvaged wood there, slow and patient, a year to a stack. Instrument makers wrote to the mill. Furniture builders drove in. The boatwrights came back. A place that had stood dead and silent his whole life had a light burning in it again, and the smell of cut wood coming off it. And men from the valley found honest work inside it. Without ever quite announcing it, Emmett Doyle had reached down into a drowned river and pulled up the very trade the valley had lost 100 years before. And Nella Marsh was there through all of it, the dock kid who had come after school to watch, saying nothing. Emmett taught her to dive, careful and slow, the way Silas had taught him, and the way Silas's grandfather had taught the rivermen before that. He taught her to read the bottom by feel, to set a chain true, to feed a lifting bag one patient breath at a time. He taught her that a log written off as lost could still be sounder than anything cut new, if you had the sense to go down after it, and the patience to bring it upright. Silas Renfrew lived to see it, and passed the winter after, and they buried him up the north road within sight of the water his family had driven. The spring Nella turned 18. Emmett Doyle stood with her on the ramp where the whole thing had started, and he handed her the black notebook, soft as cloth, every current and every broken boom written down in his careful hand. She held it like it was made of glass. And she asked him the question the whole valley had been asking for years, the one he had never once answered. She asked him why he had done it, why he had gone down alone after wood everyone swore was gone for good, back when there was no reason on earth to believe. Emmett was quiet a while, the way he always was. Then he said it, in his own plain words, the only time he ever said the thing straight out. The river never threw anything away, he told her. It only held on to it. Held on 100 years waiting to see if anybody'd care enough to come down in the dark and ask for it back. Everybody looked at that water and saw nothing. I looked at it and saw everything they'd given up on. That's the whole difference. Not the diving, just being the one who wouldn't write it off. On a shelf in the window of that old mill, where the afternoon light comes through, there sits a single fiddle. Win Farrar made it, from the first curly maple log Emmett Doyle ever raised out of the second bend, and its grain ripples like water caught and held. Nobody in Newaygo ever puts it away. It just sits there in the light, and the river runs on past the window below it, brown and slow, and full of what nobody else ever thought to want. Underwater log salvage is regulated today, and for good reason. Many states now require permits because riverbeds are shared public ground, and old logs can shelter fish and stabilize banks. Careful salvagers work only where recovery does more good than harm. The diving itself is genuinely dangerous, as pinned divers and shifting logs make clear, and it demands training and respect for the water. Done lawfully and carefully, though, it rescues irreplaceable old-growth timber that would otherwise stay lost, and turns a century-old loss into something living and useful again.